Hey everyone, it's the Koopa Man for part 2 of our Pokemon trilogy. Remember when I said Pokemon used to be much deeper? No? Alright, I rewrote that part. Anyway, it turns out it's a lot deeper than most people even realize. Take Pokemon Black and White for example. Wasn't it always funny that the first game, set in a region based on some place in the Western Hemisphere, had mascots based in the philosophies of Yin and Yang? Well, the box mascots of Reshiram and Zekrom were two parts of the same whole, and they were colored black and white for sure, but do they have anything else in common with Taoism? Well, Yang is the white, the masculine, the positive, the strong, the advocating, and the good. While Yin is the black, the feminine, the negative, the weak, the conniving, and the evil. Someone ought to tattoo that on the ass of whoever wrote Legend of Korra so they can read it to themselves in the mirror each morning. More to the point, none of these traits seem to apply. I mean, I don't get it either. Box legendaries had a lot more depth than just aesthetics before, right? Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza from Generation 3 were based on the Armageddon beasts of biblical revelation, fitting for their world-ending powers of terraforming and climate change. The box legendaries of Generation 4 were gods of space-time and antimatter. Gravity! Based on the Shinto creation myths of Izanami and Izanagi, as well as the fall of Samael into the being we now know as the devil. Heck, even Generation 2s were based on Japanese mythological figures of sea and sky. So what gives? Did Game Freak just give up? Did they run out of creative ideas? Are we just left with a hollow shell of a franchise which has no good ideas anymore? Well, yes, but not until after these games are already out. Okay, so what are they then? Well, that's the thing, dear viewer. They are the dual nature of Yin and Yang for sure, but not of the Eastern philosophy, but instead of Western philosophy. Not making any sense? Alright, come with me. We're going to school. That's right, the School of Athens. Well, where'd you think we were going? Public school? You're not gonna get this kind of education in public school. Certainly not under President Brandon. No, this is the original university. The great thinkers of Athens. Don't believe me? Look over there. It's Pythagoras and Archimedes working on their mathematical principles. And over here is Epicurus and... Is that Bobby McFerrin he's listening to? Oh, and that one in the helmet? That's Alexander the Great. Few people remember he too was a student of philosophy when he wasn't busy conquering Persia and forming the largest empire of the pre-modern era. And here's Diogenes the Cynic, lounging about, making smart quips at everyone as he just wastes the day away. But they aren't who we're here to see. No, the ones we want to talk to are right here, dead center, can't miss them. On the left is Plato, and on the right is his student Aristotle. Here, my friends, is where our box mascots are based. Now try to remember what the games themselves said about Reshiram and Zekrom. Reshiram is the embodiment of truth, while Zekrom is the embodiment of ideals, and they were formed when the two brothers had conflicts about how Unova should be ruled and how its people should live. That pretty much is a summation of Western history. Right there, the conflict between Aristotle and Plato. To fully understand, you need to know a little of what both men thought of the world. Firstly, there's the elder, Plato. Now, Plato was a student of Socrates, the man who changed Western philosophy forever, and we're going to come back to him, I promise. But what you need to know is that during Plato's lifetime, he saw his teacher assassinated for his beliefs that nothing is beyond examination. This fundamentally set Plato's views on the world and how to live in it. He's a rather tragic figure. In one of his most famous dialogues, The Republic, Plato outlined a utopian dream state where there was no more tyranny, oligarchy, or suffering, where all men's choices were made by enlightened philosopher kings, and man was free to be his ideal form. Things like liberty and democracy are done away with for the greater good, and people always did what was right because it was just the right thing to do. As this kind of society, man could evolve past his flawed nature into his more idealized self. Now, I know what you're thinking. First off, this sounds like a totalitarian nightmare, the likes of which we only see in the works of George Orwell. But second off, who would grow the food if everyone was out being philosophers and artists all day? Well, that's an easy one. Anyone who the philosopher kings didn't like were made into slaves and did all the hard labor. Yep. This idealized utopia fit with Plato's general beliefs, in that man's nature was inherently good, and any wrong he did was from outside forces acting upon him. That all things had an ideal form in which they could be made, and that all things could transcend beyond their physical limitations to become idealized. Clearly this is a man who never heard the saying, never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Starting to make connections, are we? Plato is the philosopher of ideals. He very much is the basis for Zekrom, the black dragon of ideals. Which brings us to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was sort of the yin to Plato's yang. Where Plato believed in ideal forms in the abstract, Aristotle was more practical and grounded, seeing the world for what it was rather than what it could be, or the truth if you will. Aristotle believed in virtue ethics, principles a man must follow to be a good decent person. Rather than believing that it was outside forces acting on man, he believed what made man good or bad was their actions and their ability to self-discipline. He also believed in balance in all things, his ideal, rather than too much or too little of something. The golden mean, if you will. For example, an excess of courage leads to rashness, but deficient in it leads to cowardice. Likewise, composure in excess leads to irritability, but lacking it leads to being apathetic to the world around you. Aristotle was a student first and foremost, not just of Plato, but of life itself. When confronted with the question of what is the ideal government, Aristotle would ask those around him of their views on the concept, rather than Plato thinking it should be built around the soul of a man. And that was the basis for Reshiram, the white dragon of truth, and also the conflict that defines all of history, the clashing of truth and ideals. Anytime mankind is left to his own devices, there is prosperity, until some guy comes along thinking he knows best and makes life hell for everyone else. This really is the basis for left-wing and right-wing thought. Heck, the Jacobin movement, the revolutionary movement based out of France at the tail end of the 18th century, even defined the terms left-wing and right-wing around this concept. Funny how they call themselves uppity snobs who think they know best, but you gotta give them points for honesty. Okay, well, where does that leave Curum? See, I didn't forget. Curum is the living husk of the remains of what happened to the original Unova dragon that formed into Zekrom and Reshiram. In time, it formed into its own being, absent of either force within it, taking refuge in a cave far off and feeding on those who dare to disturb it. Similarly, in Western thought, there is a newer philosophy that fits this husk-like form. We turn not to Greece, but to Germany to find it. Friedrich Nietzsche, the founder of nihilist thought. Nihilism is just that, absence. As Curum was called Wuji, the absence of yin and yang, it must also be the absence of truth and ideals. Nihilism dictates there's no point in anything that is done, and nothing in life really matters. Fittingly enough, Nietzsche himself was a Calvinist. But more to the point, nihilistic thought is that nothing matters, that there is no God and there are no morals. It rejects ideals and truths and preaches superiority and non-belief. It proposes its own superiority because it covers itself in dookie, and it claims that there's no point in life beyond this world, and any vice should be taken no matter what the consequences. It also likes to put potassium-enriched fruit up its rectum and... yeah, so it's the perfect fit for Curum. But that's only half the picture. Nihilistic thought not only rejects truth and ideals, but if forcibly attached to them, it actually takes them over and corrupts them. Take, for example, someone with a nihilistic attitude, possibly someone who experienced the horrors of war, but also put the smug self-superiority that he believes that he knows best and what the world ought to be, that his world is the ideal one. Well, you mix that all together and boom, you create one of the greatest monsters history will ever know. Take nihilistic thought and tie it to something much older, a traditionalist value set centuries old, and suddenly you're justifying the murder of countless innocents in the name of your god. Makes Sketsis seem even more of a monster than he's portrayed in the games, huh? And finally, we have the original Unova dragon, the one who founded it all. Remember Socrates? The foundation of the ideas of Aristotle and Plato were formed on Socratic thinking, and the Socratic method of critical thought. Socrates taught his students, Plato included, to think for themselves and to question everything. An unexamined life is not worth living, and the only true wisdom is that knowing you know nothing. Socrates never claimed to have all the answers, but encouraged others to go out and find out what they were. He always questioned those in powers, not out of vindictiveness, but out of genuine curiosity. And when he was voted to be assassinated for asking too many questions, he willingly drank a glass of what he knew was poison because he believed in democracy and that it would all work itself out in the end. Not bad for a game about collectible chibi monsters made for children, huh? Now if only we can get this kind of death from Game Freak again instead of... ugh. Well, maybe someday. Who knows? This has been the Koopa Man. Game on. Hey everyone. Stay tuned for the third and final part of this trilogy where we break down Scarlet and Violet and what we know so far. See you then!